Well, good morning. Thank you for your time today. As always, we're grateful for the time that we get to connect with you via these webinars. I know I see a lot of familiar names in the chat, but for those who don't know me, my name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Now, before we get started, I wanted to point out that I have colleagues on the call who will answer your questions via the chat function. So please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar by using the questions button or tab, which you should see next to the hand-raising icon, either at the top or side of the page. They'll answer your questions directly, and they'll also let me know if there are any questions they think would be helpful for the entire group. I also want to note that if you have to leave before you receive a response, then our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. And as a reminder, all of our past webinars can be reviewed on our YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube and search for CERVIS Technologies, or you can go to video.servicetech.com. And with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So today we'll be looking at a topic which is critical for understanding hours attribution within CERVIS, as well as creating and managing schedules. And that topic is registration management within events. So both for normal events and time slot events, we'll be taking a look at this. We won't necessarily be touching on service projects too much today. We're going to be focused more on the event side of things. So first off, we're going to define what a registration represents within CERVIS, and then we'll talk about how registrations are completed normally by a volunteer. Next, we'll look into methods for modifying that process by limiting the number of participants or establishing a waitlist, setting restrictions, or even requiring approval of volunteer self-registration. And then finally, we'll take a look at registrations from the admin side of the console and what you can do to engage your participants by modifying existing registrations, making notes, or marking no-shows. So let's start off by defining what a registration represents. And within CERVIS, I kind of want to start off by talking about what the three types of opportunities are. You should be familiar with this, and if you're not, let's just briefly run it down. When you create a new opportunity in CERVIS, there are three different options for the type. You have what we call normal events, time slot events, and service projects. Like I said, kind of at the head today, we're going to be talking more about normal events and time slot events today, because both of these contain within them registrations. And essentially, a registration is an entity in CERVIS that links an individual or a group to a particular shift. So for a normal event, for example, you have essentially one shift. You have a start date and time and an end date and time, and that would be the shift itself. Whereas for a time slot event, you could have multiple different shifts that the volunteer would be selecting between. But the registration is what contains the information that CERVIS uses to create reports on the metrics that you're tracking. So for example, hours, times served, and any other impact tracking items that you've established. Registrations can also contain information such as the source of registration, like whether a volunteer completed the registration themselves, or if you did it on behalf of the volunteer, or maybe they signed up through an ad that you had published. It also contains the date and time of registration. It contains any custom registration question responses, and then any notes associated with that as well. And all of that information is reportable. So let's take a brief look at the volunteer perspective, essentially how they normally complete a registration. And then we're going to jump back over and talk about how to modify that process. So when you publish an opportunity in CERVIS, it's going to get sent to your event listing page. Of course, you can also send volunteers directly to a specific event if you don't want to send them to a page like this. You can also filter this page if you want to have a specific set of events displayed to volunteers. And just while we're on the subject, I also want to briefly point out the new stickers function, which you can use associated with opportunity tags. So a volunteer could filter the events by something that meets their criteria if they're looking for something specifically. And again, we have a webinar on this subject if you want to learn more about it. But essentially, if a volunteer finds an event that they're interested in, they can click to learn more about it. And then if they find a shift that they want to register for, they just click to sign up. And again, you can modify this registration process, but normally, if a volunteer is new, then at this step, the system wouldn't know them, and so they would send them to an account check page that asks them for their email address and first name. This is just checking whether or not this person already has a profile. If they don't already have an account, the next page will be asking them to fill out an application. If they do already have an account, then it would ask them to basically just log in using their password. And if they don't know their password, they can reset it on the next page as well. But once a volunteer logs in, either after creating a new account or just by entering their password, then they'll basically be completing their registration. And once a volunteer completes a registration, they get a confirmation message. That email is sent to them right away with all the details about what they signed up for. And if they want to do anything else from here, that's kind of up to them. They could sign up for another shift. They could sign up a family member for that same shift or another shift. They could also manage their account, run reports, view awards they've earned, all that sort of stuff. But generally speaking, a volunteer is going to sign up for a shift and then kind of move on. So that's sort of the standard volunteer process. Let's switch back to the admin side here and take a look at the different ways that we can modify that registration process. So the first thing I want to point out is that any opportunity you create can have kind of a truncated version of the registration process, which we refer to as quick reg. So every opportunity that you generate, you can enable or not quick reg. It is disabled by default. Quick reg basically just truncates the registration process, as the name kind of implies. So let's take a look at that really quickly. I have that turned on here for an event in my system called Neighborhood and School Cleanup. You wouldn't know it by looking at this event. I know it because I set it up. But if a volunteer goes to register for this event, they do the same thing. They find a shift that they're interested in, click to register. And when they do that, in this case, it's just going to pop up a tab that asks them for a name, phone, email. You can add other information to your quick reg profile if you want to collect more than this. But basically, if someone already has an account, when they click on sign up, it'll just basically verify their registration. They get a confirmation message, they're done. If the person is new, so if the system doesn't recognize their information, then it'll have them fill out the rest of your quick reg profile, which in my case contains birth date as well as the terms and conditions. But all of that takes place essentially within this page. So if a volunteer is completing a quick reg for a particular event, then they'll get a confirmation message right here, and they are done at that step. They're not logging in. They won't be editing their account or viewing awards or anything like that. They've essentially moved on. So that's one way to modify the registration process, is to enable quick reg for a particular event. You can also modify registration by restricting who is allowed to register for an event. So with any normal event or time slot event, you can set restrictions. So those restrictions can take a number of different forms. You can restrict registrations for an event by gender or by age, by background check status, custom fields that you've created in your system configuration, checklist items, or group membership. So all of those can be used to set restrictions. And you can also use custom registration questions. We'll talk about those more in a moment. But all of these are based on your general application. So when someone creates a profile, they're giving you some of this information, or in the case of like a background check or a checklist item, you're marking things off on a volunteer's profile once they've completed them. The way restrictions work in Service is you select who is allowed to register, not who's prevented from registering. So for example, if I have an event where I need volunteers who are over 25 and have passed a background check, then that's exactly what I would set in here. So for the age restriction, I would put 25 as the minimum. Obviously, if you want a max, you can do that. The system defaults to 150 as a max. And then for background check restriction, I would say I want yes passed. So again, I'm choosing who I want to register for this event, not who I'm preventing from registering. An important thing to do as well when you're setting restrictions on an event is down at the bottom, you can set a specific or custom failure message. So if someone doesn't meet the requirements for your event, there is a generic failure message that just says they don't meet the requirements. Unless your requirements are an age restriction or a gender restriction, the system won't tell them what are the requirements that they don't meet, because it could be sensitive information. But what I generally like to do, unless the restriction is just an age requirement, I usually like to customize this failure message to give my volunteer, next steps. So for example, in this case, I have a background check as a requirement. So I might write something in here about how, this event requires a background check. Please contact Bruce for more information, or give the volunteer something proactive that they can do. Maybe they have to go and sign up for an orientation first. So I might tell them to go and pick an orientation to sign up for. But I usually like to customize this message to give my volunteers next steps instead of just having them get rejected. So this is another way to edit kind of the registration process, is to limit who is allowed to register by setting a restriction. Now, I mentioned custom registration questions, so let's briefly talk about that. Any opportunity that you create, I'm going to go into search and manage existing opportunities here. Any opportunity has the option to add custom registration questions. And if we click on that menu item, from there you can select from any of the existing questions you've already created and use those as a restriction if you need to. You can also create new questions on the bottom right here. Click on Manage Registration Question Inventory. And then when you're creating a custom question like this, if you want to make it something that prohibits registration, if a volunteer doesn't answer correctly, like let's say, for example, you have a training that you want volunteers to review on YouTube before they can sign up for this event, you could have a question that would be a selection box that might be required and is active because you're currently using it. The question might be, have you reviewed the training? Maybe the online training, right? The selection options would be what the volunteer can pick between. So we'd want to do a yes, no here. So we just add a comma between those. And then the required answer would be yes. And then I could set a failure message that would say, you need to review the training before you can register for this event. So essentially I'm creating a required question with a required answer. And if the volunteer doesn't select yes, they've reviewed the training, then it'll present them with a failure message that I write out through here. So once you've made a question like this, then on any event, you can say that question is a requirement. So this, have you reviewed the online training? I can select that for the event, say save custom registration question. And now whenever someone registers for this event, they have to say that yes, they've reviewed that training in order to complete their registration. So it's just another way to add a restriction on an event. I often like using them in this exact kind of context where you're basically saying, hey, you have to review this training first. So they're either telling you, yes, they have reviewed it, or they're directly lying to you that they haven't. But this is kind of a nice gate to make sure that people are doing that first. So that's kind of another way to set restrictions. And then there's one other major way to modify the registration process, and that would be by making an opportunity an approval process. So for any event, normal event or time slot event, in the advanced options, you can set the option to basically limit or require approval of volunteer self-registration. So this is towards the bottom in the advanced options. It says require approval of volunteer self-registration. It's set to no by default. For a normal event, you'll have the option of yes. For a time slot event, you also have yes first time only. What this setting does is when someone registers for this event, they do not get added directly to the registration list. Instead, they get added to a pending list, and then you can approve or reject people from that list directly. So I usually use this in one of two scenarios. One, if I need to vet every single registration, I want to manually check each person, or maybe call them or call their reference or do some kind of process before they are registered for this shift. That's one scenario where I would use this setting. Another scenario is if I want to pick from a pool of applicants. So maybe I'm not just necessarily looking to approve every person. What I want to do is get a bunch of people to apply, and then I can hand pick from that list who is actually approved. So with this setting turned on to yes, again, every registration gets stopped. There's essentially a stopgap where you have to then go and approve them. For time slot events, you can also say first time only, which means once the volunteer is registered for one of the time slots, whether you did it on the back end or they went through the approval process and you approved them. But once someone is registered for one shift, then they can register for any other shifts, which this can be really useful too. let's say you have a particular position where you want people to be able to sign up themselves, but if they're a first timer, you need to do some questioning or interviewing or whatever. This would be one way to kind of get around that sort of hurdle. Another would be to use something like a checklist item where you could say they're approved for this type of task. Let me briefly show you what this looks like when it's enabled for an event. So with that option turned on, when a volunteer registers, they get added to a pending list instead of being added directly into the event. So those events will have this option. You'll be able to see review pending event registration requests if there are any open or pending registration requests. So I can go into this menu to view that, but I can also see it directly in viewing the registered volunteers. So I can see here, this shows both people who are registered and people who are on that pending list. And we can see the order that they are on that pending list. From this menu, I could go through and approve people. There's an option down at the bottom to approve those pending registrations. But I want to show you that other menu too. If we go into sort of that inbox menu to review pending event registration requests, you can see that same kind of thing here. And I can go through select individuals, approve and email, or disapprove. You can also just delete a request if you don't want to add a note to the person's profile, because disapproving a request will add a note to their account. So this same menu is also reachable from the main dashboard. You can see that same icon here. This will only appear in your database if you have an event with this setting turned on and there are pending registration requests. So if you're not seeing this on your main dashboard, it's because you're not currently using it. Okay, so those are all kind of different ways to modify the registration process when a volunteer is signing up for an event. There's one other pretty significant, but you should probably be aware of it already, and that would be just basically limiting how many people can register for an event. For a normal event, you obviously have to identify how many number of volunteers are needed. There is a note here that says 0 equals unlimited, so if you don't have a cap, you can leave that as 0. If you do have a cap, you can set that to whatever that number might be. So I could take 25 people, let's say, for this event, then I could set that as a limit. Same kind of concept exists within time slot events, although within time slots, you cannot input that you need 0 volunteers, meaning unlimited. You do have to input a specific number of volunteers that you need. Now, kind of along those lines, if you have that limit in place, you can also enable a waitlist. So the waitlist is a setting. It is not enabled by default. If we scroll down, you can see it says allow waitlist when registration is full. If this is enabled, then when a volunteer tries to register for the event, if it is already full, they'll get added to the waitlist. And they'll see that they're getting added to a waitlist. It's not obscured from them. They can also see how many people are already on the waitlist ahead of them. So if that might influence what shift they would apply for, that can. But basically the waitlist functions automatically. If someone is on the waitlist and someone else who is registered cancels, or if you expand the number of volunteers needed so that there is a gap on the event, then the system will automatically fill those positions using the waitlist. And when someone gets added from the event from the waitlist to the event itself, they do receive a confirmation message right away. It's the same thing that they would normally receive. If they've double booked themselves or they now can't do that shift, they can cancel through that email, and then it would just go to the next person on the wait list. So obviously a very helpful tool. And again, it kind of functions more in the background. You can freeze or modify the wait list if you need to from the admin side. But normally you just kind of let that run on its own. Okay, the last thing that I want to look at today in terms of registrations is, at least from the volunteer perspective, is source tracking. So when a volunteer registers for an event, normally, they're either signing up on their own or they're signing up from the admin side. So you have registered the volunteer. But something you can do within Service is actually track the source of a registration. So let's say, for example, you are publishing an ad on Facebook and you want to know how many new volunteers were generated through that ad or how many people signed up by clicking on that link. In Service, every event has its own direct links. If I go into manage an opportunity, we can see through here, there's a direct opportunity link. And there's also a private version. If you have like a hidden event, you can do tracking that way too. But if this is a publicly posted event, that's kind of the most useful case for using source tracking. I can grab the direct opportunity link. There's two different versions. They both do the same thing. There's just a short version and a long version. I typically prefer to use the short version. But if we copy that out, this is a link directly to this specific event. So if I were to go to that link, I'm just going to open up an incognito page so that I'm logged out. But if I were to go to that link, it just goes straight to this event. So I could post that on Facebook or somewhere and have volunteers basically sign up for that shift. But source tracking allows you to add a tag to that to identify, if you're publishing, again, an ad on Facebook or something like that, then you can use essentially just a line to add just extra information. So I'm actually going to log out here, and then we'll do this in this browser. So if I go to that link, I can add to the end of that /Facebook. Or I could add something else. If I was publishing this somewhere else, whatever I want to add here, I can just add a word, and that will become a source that I'm tracking. And if someone goes to that link, then they'll be able to register just like normal. Nothing is different from the volunteer's perspective. They're signing up like normal, but you'll notice, it might be kind of hard to see, but in the URL here, it tells us that there's a source on that. And if we go ahead and click on this to sign up and just register like normal, again, this could be a new volunteer or an existing volunteer. Once the registration has been completed, again, the volunteer knows nothing different, but on your end, you now can run a report that will tell you how many people signed up using that particular link. If a new volunteer creates a profile using that link as well, then that can also give you some extra information. So this is a newer feature in the system configuration. Under system settings, you can tell the system to auto tag new volunteer profiles created via source tracking. So if someone creates a new account via that sourced link or that tracked link, then it'll add a tag to that person's profile, which is then something you can search by and run a report on and all that sort of stuff. But even without using those tags, now if we go and look at this event, so that was this Trails and Waterways event here, I can select multiple events here, or I could just choose this one. And if I go in to print out a summary, which again, I can do this through the main menu for the event also. But if I print out this summary, you'll see that this will tell me all of my registration sources. So I've had one person sign up using that Facebook sourced link. And again, what those links are called, entirely up to you. So let me just briefly run back through the formatting of how you add that in. And then I want to mention one other way that you can use those. So every event in your system, if you go into Manage an Opportunity, has down here a direct opportunity link. And if you click on that, it pops up two versions. If you use the shortened version, if you want to add a source to that, all you need to do is copy it out, and then wherever you're sending it, just add / whatever you want your term to be. So that's pretty much it to do the shortened version. Very simple, and then you can just use that directly. If you want to use the long form, it's a little bit different, similar concept. I've copied that out here, but you can actually see at the top of the page anyway. You just add & source equals, and then whatever your term is. Personally, I usually prefer just using the short version. It's a little bit easier to remember, but that's kind of an easy way to do that. We do have support articles on this subject as well in case you want to reference that later. One other thing you can do with this is once you've created that link, you can also create QR codes. So maybe you wanted to make a flyer. What you could do is basically just paste that link in and then generate a QR code. So on the main dashboard, Service has this search bar. If you paste a URL into this, it'll ask you if you want to generate a QR code based on that. So if we had one of those source links, I could just copy this one and paste that in here. I could generate a QR code on that, and then I could basically just right click to save that image or copy it and then put it into a flyer or something like that. Okay, so that's sourced registrations. Again, if you have questions about that, we do have an article on the subject that kind of walks through the steps of how to use that and how to report on that. But that's also an excellent tool, especially if you're trying to figure out how well your ads are doing at pulling in new volunteers. And specifically with that, the tag that you can now add in the system configuration. Every time a new volunteer creates a profile through a source link like that, they'll be tagged, and you can then go and use that to run reports and all sorts of things. Okay, so the last subject that I want to cover today is just engaging with existing registrations from the admin perspective. So if you are logged into the admin side of Service and you go into search and manage existing opportunities, we've kind of already been on this page a little bit today, but you can, for every event in the system, go to view registered volunteers. When you are on this page, there's a number of things that you can do. Obviously, right at the top, I can add people in. So if I want to search for someone by name and add them to this event, I can select them, register them, sign them up for a shift. So you can do that action, obviously, from the admin side. Something important to note is that when you are operating on the admin side of Service, it does not send emails on your behalf automatically unless you are clicking a button that actually says send email. So if I were to register this person for this event, then this person's not going to receive a notification of that registration unless I choose to then select that registration and then down at the bottom say send confirmation message. There's two versions. There's a manual version and an automatic version. They're both the same content. It's just whether you want to review it or edit it before you send it out or just send it directly. And this is the same email that volunteers receive normally. Okay, so obviously you can, from the admin side, add people to an event. Likewise, you can also remove people from an event. So if you select a registration here, down at the bottom, you can unregister a volunteer. Now that would be, of course, if you're kind of canceling on behalf of that person, they can take those actions themselves. But let's say someone didn't show up for a shift, then you'd want to mark that person as a no-show. Marking a no-show does two things. It removes them from the event. It also adds a no-show note to their profile, which is something that you can then go and search by. You can find people based on how many no-shows they've had within a given time frame. All right, and then also while we're on this page, on the right-hand side, if you do have custom registration questions for an event, you'll see that icon here. You can click to view someone's responses or modify that later. Obviously, in the case of a question like this, I don't really need to review that because they have to have said yes in order to sign up for this event. That's the question we established earlier. But maybe you have a question asking some more information gathering or other data like that. You could review those questions through here. You can also log or view impact. Just a brief reminder, impact is a way to record additional numerical metrics. So this is a cleanup event. I'm tracking things like how many pounds of trash were removed or how many bags of trash, that kind of information. So I could review what people recorded and modify that myself through this log impact option. And then, of course, I can also see registration notes or add in my own registration notes if I need to. So there are a few other things you can do on this page, like emulating the sign-in console. You can also use the calendar icon to adjust someone's activity, which this is kind of important to note. If you want to give one person more or less credit, if you're using the sign-in console, that's going to happen automatically if people are signing in and signing out. But if you want to go and manually adjust one person's activity, you can click on this icon, assign how many hours that one person is going to receive, and adjust their activity without affecting anybody else. Okay, well, those are kind of the main topics that I wanted to touch on today. We're going to move into questions next. We've had a couple come in that I want to address already. Obviously, feel free to keep writing in your questions if you do have those. But one question was, can you receive notifications when volunteers register themselves? And the answer is yes. I did not touch on that today, so you didn't miss that if you were asking that. If we click into adding an opportunity or editing an existing opportunity, under the additional organizer options, there are items or options to receive notifications of registrations or cancellations. These are both set to no by default on every opportunity. If you set this to yes for either of these, those notifications will go to the organizers of the event. So if we scroll back up a little bit, every event has a primary and could have a secondary organizer. These people have to have at least event leader access in your system. Of course, they could be admin, that's fine. But then these are the individuals who will receive those notifications of registrations or cancellations if you choose to turn on those notifications. Okay, and then another question came in that was, can you apply a reservation code to an existing registrant? So if someone has already registered for an event and they have not used a reservation code that you were expecting them to use, you can remove them and then re-add them using the code, but you can't just consume the code by placing it on an existing registration. So for example, if this person should have used the reservation code, what I would need to, if I wanted to modify that, what I would need to do is remove that person from the shift and then re-add them using the reservation code. And you can do that from the admin side. They're not going to receive these notifications at all because, again, you're doing this from the admin perspective. So you could remove them from the shift and then re-register them for that shift. And they won't receive notifications unless you choose to send it. But if you want to adjust someone's registration and add a reservation code to it, those are the steps you need to take. So remove them first, and then you can re-add them at the top of the page by selecting a reservation code at the same time, and then that would add that in there. Okay, so I think those are the questions that we had for the group as a whole. Obviously, if you have any other questions, please feel free to continue writing those in or ask our support team later. I do want to point out the resources that we have available to you. I mentioned them today, but it's always good to reiterate that. Whenever you are logged into Service, you will always see at the bottom of the page this Need Help option. This is how you contact our support team. Click on that. You can ask a question through here. So we talked about source tracking today. If you search for the term source, you can see there's articles that have to do with registration source tracking reports or tracking registration sources. And again, this just lays out what we talked about and how to do that yourself. Usually when I'm reading these articles, I prefer to pop them open in another tab just because then they're a little bit easier to read. But there's a lot of resources in there. No matter what you've searched by, though, you can always click on Contact Us and submit a ticket to our customer support team. And then I wanted to mention, too, if you would like to review any of our past webinars, you can go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies, or if you go to video.servicetech.com, that will also take you to our YouTube channel, and you can review those from there. All right. Well, once again, I want to thank you for your time today. As always, it is a pleasure to see you in the chat. I know I've met with a lot of you directly, so thank you for joining. We as a team are grateful for the work that you do throughout all the different organizations and communities that you're serving and impacting. And really partnering with you is one of the most satisfying aspects of our work. So if you have any questions from our content today, or really anything regarding utilizing your system, feel free to reach out to our support team. Again, using that Need Help button or just by contacting support@servicetech.com. So thanks for your time. Hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday.